In the quaint town of Saint Sebastian, nestled in the quiet embrace of rolling hills and ancient forests, there was a priest known to all as Father Marcus. His church, the gleaming beacon of faith, stood tall and proud, a testament to his unyielding dedication to his congregation. Yet, beyond the confessional's sacred veil, whispers of his transgressions began to echo through the hallowed halls. The whispers grew louder, a symphony of unspoken horrors that no one dared to confront. Amongst the shadows of his congregation, a lady named Clara found refuge from the storm of her own life. Recently divorced, Clara faced a world that had turned its back on her. With a heavy heart and dwindling resources, she sought solace and guidance from the very man she would later come to fear. Father Marcus, a man who had devoted his life to the Word of God, had become a monster in the eyes of Clara. His actions, unspeakable and vile, left her spirit scarred and her future uncertain. The priest, blinded by his own power, believed his position granted him impunity, that the sanctity of his vestments shielded him from the consequences of his sins. Clara, however, was made of sterner stuff. She refused to be a silent victim. As the whispers grew into a deafening roar, Clara knew she had to act. The priest's grip on her soul was too tight, his shadow too suffocating. With a steely resolve, she made a plan, meticulous in its detail, driven by the desperate need to survive. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara went to the church under the guise of seeking spiritual counsel. Father Marcus, oblivious to the storm brewing within her, welcomed her with his usual paternal smile. But as he leaned in close to offer his holy guidance, Clara's hand, trembling with a mix of fear and anger, reached for the knife she had concealed. As she had already planned, when the priest reached for his neck, she slid it and ran away, leaving the sanctuary stained with his crimson lifeblood. The town awoke the next day to the shocking news. The beloved priest lay lifeless in the very place where he had offered solace to so many. The townsfolk gathered in hushed groups, sharing their disbelief and praying for the soul of the man they had trusted. The air hung heavy with a mixture of shock and a nascent, unsettling suspicion. No one could fathom such a sacrilege in their peaceful, devout Saint Sebastian. They spoke of divine retribution, of a demon walking among them, but never of Father Marcus himself being the source of any evil. Meanwhile, Clara, the grieving widow, had disappeared without a trace. Her absence, initially attributed to shock and grief, would soon become a chilling puzzle piece. The whispers of the priest's misdeeds, once hushed and easily dismissed, grew into accusations, a venomous chorus that began to dismantle the saintly image the town had so carefully constructed. Soon, the once revered man was vilified in the eyes of those he had served, a stark and brutal fall from grace. The investigation into the murder of Father Marcus began with a fervor that matched the town's grief, yet it was tinged with an underlying current of denial. How could their Father Marcus, the pillar of their community, be involved in anything that would lead to such a violent end? Detective Laura Castellanos, a seasoned officer with a keen eye for detail and an unwavering commitment to truth, was assigned to the case. She arrived in Saint Sebastian not with the town's preconceived notions, but with an open mind, meticulously surveying the crime scene, a place now desecrated not just by death, but by the shattering of faith. The crimson stain on the polished altar floor, a stark contrast to the ethereal glow of the stained glass, spoke volumes to Laura. It wasn't just blood, it was a wound in the town's soul. As she dug deeper, interviewing parishioners, studying the priest's routines, and sifting through the layers of grief and shock, the whispers grew louder, no longer just distant echoes, but palpable murmurs from the shadows. The picture of a saintly man of God began to crack, fissures appearing in the polished veneer of his reputation. Laura noted the nervous glances, the hesitant answers, the way certain parishioners seemed to flinch when asked about the priest's personal habits or specific interactions. The truth, stark and terrifying, slowly emerged from the shadows, like a serpent uncoiling itself in the light. Clara, it seemed, had not been the only one to suffer at the priest's hands. Laura's initial interviews, seemingly innocuous questions about the priest's character, began to yield unsettling patterns. A young altar boy, barely in his teens, stumbled over words when asked if Father Marcus had ever shown him special attention. A nervous spinster, known for her devotion, quickly changed the subject when questioned about the confessional. These were not just isolated incidents. They were threads in a growing tapestry of misconduct that was far more sinister than anyone in St. Sebastian had dared to imagine. The evidence grew, slowly at first, then with an accelerating, horrifying momentum, painting a damning picture of a man who had used his sacred position to prey on the vulnerable, twisting faith into a tool for his own depravity. Laura meticulously cataloged witness accounts, cross-referencing dates and times, and soon a clear, disturbing pattern emerged. Father Marcus was not just a predator, he was a manipulator, a psychological torturer who leveraged the trust placed in him, the sanctity of the confessional, and the desperate hopes of his flock for his own twisted desires. The more Laura learned, the more the initial shock transformed into a cold, righteous anger. It became abundantly clear that Clara's actions were not those of a cold-hearted killer driven by malice, but a desperate soul fighting back against a monster in their midst, a woman pushed to the very precipice of human endurance. The knife that had taken the priest's life was not the weapon of a calculating murderer, meticulously wielded for vengeance, but the last defense of a woman pushed beyond the brink of despair, a desperate act of survival in a world that had offered her no other escape. Laura's investigation unearthed tales of intimidation, of veiled threats during confession, of parishioners being ostracized if they dared to question the priest's authority or behavior. One woman recounted how Father Marcus had subtly but persistently interfered in her divorce proceedings, guiding her towards decisions that benefited him, not her. Another spoke of financial manipulation, of donations that seemed to disappear into the priest's personal coffers, often from the most impoverished members of the congregation. As the story unfolded, piece by agonizing piece, the town of St. Sebastian was forced to confront the dark secrets it had buried deep within its heart for decades. The very foundation of their community, built on the bedrock of faith and trust in their spiritual leader, was shaken to its core, crumbling under the weight of the horrifying revelations. The trust they had placed in Father Marcus was irrevocably broken, replaced by a profound sense of betrayal and a creeping, uncomfortable shame. Clara's act of violence, initially seen as a heinous crime, had not only claimed the life of a priest, but had also shone a blinding, inescapable light on the hidden sins of their sanctum, exposing a festering wound that had been ignored for far too long. The idyllic facade of St. Sebastian, a town of quiet devotion and communal harmony, shattered, revealing a darker underbelly where fear and silence had allowed evil to flourish. The townsfolk, once united in grief, now found themselves fractured by the truth, wrestling with their own complicity, their own silent acquiescence in the face of growing unease. The hunt for Clara grew intense, initially fueled by a thirst for justice for their fallen priest. But as the truth of her profound suffering became known, the town's outrage shifted dramatically, turning its burning focus onto the man who had once been their beloved shepherd. The whispers of her bravery, initially timid and hesitant, began to replace the cries for justice, growing into a chorus of quiet admiration. Laura Castellanos, driven by her own deeply ingrained sense of right and wrong, and now a fervent advocate for Clara's truth, continued her relentless investigation, determined to ensure that Clara's name would not be tarnished by the very community she had sought refuge in, a community that had, albeit unknowingly, allowed her torment to persist. Laura faced resistance, not from the police force who recognized her skill, but from some of the town's more influential citizens, those who had perhaps benefited from Father Marcus's subtle manipulations, or those who simply wished to maintain the illusion of their perfect, pious community. She encountered closed doors, evasive answers, and even thinly veiled threats designed to deter her from digging too deep. But Laura was unyielding. She understood that Clara's fate was inextricably linked to the truth of Father Marcus's long-hidden crimes, and she would not rest until every dark corner was illuminated. As Laura meticulously pieced together the grisly puzzle of Father Marcus's crimes, a task that became more daunting with each new sickening discovery, she stumbled upon a labyrinthine web of deceit that stretched far beyond the confines of the church's sacred doors. It appeared that the priest had not been the only one with deeply buried secrets to hide. A complicit network of powerful figures within the town had actively turned a blind eye to his abhorrent transgressions, or worse, had actively facilitated them, allowing his insidious reign of terror to continue unabated, unchecked, and unquestioned for years. This revelation was a seismic shock, even to Laura, who had grown accustomed to the depravity of human nature in her line of work. Laura's discovery of their undeniable complicity in his systematic cover-up brought forth a wave of incandescent anger and profound disgust that ripped through the very fabric of St. Sebastian, tearing down the last vestiges of its once unblemished reputation. The town's prominent lawyer, Mr. Henderson, whose family had been pillars of the community for generations, was found to have quietly squashed multiple complaints lodged against Father Marcus with the diocesan authorities, citing lack of credible evidence. The mayor, Eleanor Vance, a devout Catholic and a close confidant of the priest, had diverted church funds into seemingly legitimate but ultimately obscure accounts controlled by Father Marcus, blurring the lines between charity and personal enrichment. Even Dr. Alistair Finch, the respected town physician, had provided false medical certificates, excusing Father Marcus from public duties at times when his more egregious activities might have been exposed. This intricate network of silent enablers and active collaborators created a suffocating environment where the priest's victims felt utterly alone and powerless, their pleas for help falling on deaf ears, or worse, being actively suppressed. Laura saw how the town's reverence for the church, coupled with its small-town insularity and a deeply ingrained fear of scandal, had created the perfect breeding ground for such pervasive corruption. The very pillars of St. Sebastian had become the chains that bound its most vulnerable citizens to their tormentor. Clara, meanwhile, had vanished into the night like a ghost, leaving behind a faint but persistent trail of breadcrumbs that, with Laura's relentless tracking, led to a local shelter for abused women, nestled quietly on the outskirts of a neighboring, larger city. Laura found her there, not broken in spirit, but undeniably haunted by the specter of her past, a fragility lingering behind her eyes despite her burgeoning strength. The shelter, a sanctuary of shared pain and quiet resilience, had given Clara a space to breathe, to begin the agonizing process of healing, but the trauma of her experience still clung to her like a shroud. With trembling hands that still bore the faint tremor of the fateful night, Clara, encouraged by the shelter's compassionate counselors, recounted the full spectrum of horrors she had endured at Father Marcus's hands and the agonizing moments leading up to the act that had freed her, but forever marked her. Laura listened, her own empathy a tangible presence in the small, quiet room, understanding that Clara's story was not merely one of survival, but a chilling testament to the extreme lengths to which a human spirit could be pushed. The priest, Laura now understood with absolute clarity, had left Clara no choice but to fight back, to reclaim her very essence from the monster who sought to consume it. Clara described the insidious way Father Marcus had cultivated her trust, preying on her vulnerability after her divorce, offering comforting words that slowly twisted into veiled threats and coercive demands. He had isolated her, making her believe he was her only source of guidance and support. She spoke of the gradual erosion of her self-worth, the gnawing fear that he held power over her spiritual salvation, and the escalating physical and psychological abuse that had become her daily nightmare. The knife, she explained, was not an act of premeditated murder in the traditional sense, but a desperate, instinctual lashing out against an inescapable evil, a final desperate gasp for freedom as his suffocating grip threatened to extinguish her entirely. It was self-defense in its rawest, most fundamental form, born from a primal scream for survival. The case grew exponentially more complex as Laura faced the monumental challenge of convincing the town, and indeed the broader legal system, that Clara was not a villain, a cold-blooded murderer, but a survivor. A woman who had been driven to an unthinkable act by an equally unthinkable torment. The townsfolk, already reeling from the revelations about Father Marcus, grappled intensely with the profound and deeply unsettling revelation that their trust had been so egregiously, so utterly betrayed, not just by the priest, but by those in power who had enabled him. The Church of St. Sebastian, once a seemingly impenetrable bastion of comfort, faith, and spiritual guidance, had, in Clara's lived experience, become a terrifying prison for her soul, a place where solace turned to torment. Laura, witnessing the sheer weight of Clara's suffering and the profound injustice she had faced, vowed to do everything in her considerable power to not only ensure Clara's freedom, but to also establish systemic protections to ensure the safety and well-being of others from falling prey to this same horrifying fate. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was a crusade for justice, for truth, and for the fundamental right of every individual to be safe from abuse, especially from those cloaked in authority and trust. The initial outrage against Clara began to morph into a nuanced understanding, a slow dawning recognition that their perception of events had been fundamentally flawed. Elderly women who had dismissed the initial whispers now remembered instances where Father Marcus had been uncharacteristically harsh or possessive with certain parishioners. Men who had revered him began to recall an unsettling aura of control and manipulation that they had previously attributed to piety. The town's collective guilt began to surface, a heavy burden of silent complicity. The trial was a spectacle, a chilling and visceral battleground where the sacred tenets of faith tragically met the profane realities of human depravity. Clara's harrowing story was laid bare for all to see, dissected and scrutinized under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny, and in doing so, the town's dark, festering underbelly was brutally exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of truth. As the days of testimony and cross-examination dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity to Clara, more women, emboldened by Clara's sheer courage and the protective presence of Laura Castellanos, began to come forward, their voices, once silenced by fear and shame, joining Clara's in a powerful, undeniable chorus of pain, defiance, and a desperate plea for recognition. The town's collective conscience was pricked, a deep, agonizing wound opening up, and the long-standing, impenetrable walls of silence, built over decades of fear and denial, finally crumbled under the weight of accumulating truths. The priest's enablers, the lawyer, the mayor, the doctor, and others who had implicitly or explicitly supported him, were called to account. Their complicity laid bare for the entire world to see. Slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion, once a raging current of condemnation against Clara, began its inexorable shift, turning instead towards a profound empathy and a burning desire for systemic change. The courtroom became a microcosm of Saint Sebastian, a place where denial clashed with revelation, where a cherished illusion of sanctity was replaced by a grim reality of abuse. Each new testimony chipped away at the town's comfortable facade, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth of what they had allowed to happen in their midst. Clara, though terrified, found strength in the growing number of women who stood with her, their shared experiences forging an unbreakable shield against the accusations. Clara, now undeniably a symbol of raw courage and unwavering resilience in the face of unspeakable evil, faced her accusers with a quiet dignity that belied the unimaginable horrors she had suffered. Her composure, born not of indifference but of a profound inner strength forged in the crucible of her torment, commanded the jury's attention. The jury, composed of her fellow townsfolk, a cross-section of St. Sebastian's grieving and conflicted community, sat in rapt attention, their faces etched with a mixture of horror, shame, and growing understanding, as she spoke with a clear, steady voice of her pervasive fear, her desperate struggle for survival, and ultimately her heart-wrenching, agonizing decision to fight back. Laura, her voice ringing with the conviction of absolute truth, presented her meticulously gathered findings with a fervor that matched Clara's own quiet power, painting a damning, irrefutable portrait of a man who had not only abused his position, but had systematically used the holy cloth to cloak his monstrosity, transforming a symbol of spiritual guidance into a tool of terror. She presented evidence of Father Marcus's financial improprieties, his psychological manipulation tactics, and the testimonies of other women who had been victimized, detailing how he had used his authority to control and exploit them. The defense, scrambling, tried to paint Clara as unstable, vengeful, and unreliable, highlighting her recent divorce and her emotional vulnerability. But Laura had anticipated this, presenting expert testimony from psychologists who explained the profound impact of prolonged abuse on a victim's psyche, reframing Clara's instability as a direct consequence of the priest's actions. The courtroom, once a place of judgment, became a space of collective realization, as the weight of the evidence and the raw honesty of Clara and the other survivors began to dismantle every last shred of doubt. The town council members, who had dismissed earlier complaints, squirmed in their seats as Laura presented irrefutable documentation of their negligence and complicity. The once whispered accusations of Father Marcus's enablers now echoed loudly through the courtroom. Undeniable facts. In the end, it was the very community that Clara had once feared, the town that had silently enabled her torment, that ultimately rallied around her. Their initial disbelief transformed into a fierce, protective solidarity. They saw in her not a criminal, but the embodiment of the strength and resilience they had been searching for in themselves, the courage to face an uncomfortable truth that had festered for too long. The verdict of not guilty, when finally pronounced by the foreman, was met with a potent, cathartic mix of profound relief and simmering anger. A collective communal sigh that simultaneously released the town from the suffocating grip of its dark secret and heralded a new, fragile beginning. The relief was for Clara, for the breaking of the silence. The anger was for the years of complicity and the systemic failures that had allowed such evil to flourish. The Church of Saint Sebastian was forever changed. its very stones imbued with the ghosts of past transgressions and the echoes of newfound truth. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with glorious tales of faith and salvation, now cast a muted, almost somber light on the polished pews, as if the very light of God had dimmed in the face of such profound human failing. The town mourned, not just for the physically departed Father Marcus, but for the profound innocence lost, the shattering of a collective illusion, and the painful recognition of their own collective blindness. Yet, amidst the lingering shadows of grief and shame, a new dawn, fragile but undeniable, began to break over Saint Sebastian. Clara's story, her harrowing journey from victim to survivor, had not merely been a legal battle. It had become a potent catalyst for sweeping, overdue change, a beacon that shone a harsh, revealing light on the hitherto hidden corners of their lives, forcing them, as individuals and as a community, to confront the uncomfortable darkness within themselves, to acknowledge their own silences and complicities. The priest's insidious legacy was undeniably one of fear, profound pain, and pervasive deceit, a scar on the soul of Saint Sebastian. But Clara's burgeoning legacy was one of unwavering hope, profound redemption, and empowering liberation. Her trial had not only brought her personal justice, a reclaiming of her shattered self, but had also set in motion a powerful, unstoppable reckoning that would meticulously reshape the very fabric of Saint Sebastian, stripping away its false piety and rebuilding it on a foundation of genuine accountability and transparency. The town, once tragically divided by insidious whispers and fearful silence, now stood united in their pursuit of the truth, ready to face the long-buried demons of their past and collectively forge a future that was truly worthy of their faith, a future built on honesty, empathy, and vigilance. As Clara stepped out of the courthouse, a free woman, she was met with a wave of emotion that washed over her, a mix of thunderous applause and empathetic tears. The survivors who had found the unimaginable strength to speak out against Father Marcus surged forward, embracing her, their shared experiences forging an unbreakable bond of sisterhood, a testament to the power of collective trauma overcome. Laura Castellanos watched the scene unfold with a solemn pride, a quiet satisfaction knowing that her relentless work had not only brought a definitive end to the priest's terrifying reign of abuse, but had also, more importantly, given a powerful, resonant voice to the voiceless, to those who had suffered in silence for far too long. The justice for Father Marcus's crimes was only one part of the victory. The true triumph was the liberation of those he had preyed upon. The ripples of Clara's singular act of desperation and the subsequent public revelations spread far and wide, extending beyond the quiet confines of Saint Sebastian. Other towns, hearing the harrowing details of the Saint Sebastian scandal, began to question the men of the cloth within their own communities, a wave of introspection and suspicion washing over hitherto unquestioned authority. The Church, as an institution, was forced to confront the dark, unsettling reality of its own making, the systemic failures that had allowed such abuse to flourish unchecked for decades. In the wake of St. Sebastian's devastating scandal, a palpable tremor ran through dioceses across the region and beyond, forcing a long-overdue reckoning. New, stringent policies were swiftly enacted to protect the vulnerable. Mandatory reporting laws, independent oversight committees, and enhanced background checks for clergy members. The clergy, once perceived as untouchable, cloaked in an aura of unquestionable sanctity, were now firmly under the watchful, scrutinizing eye of the law and, perhaps even more powerfully, under the renewed and demanding vigilance of their own congregations. The era of unquestioning obedience was over. Clara, a phoenix risen from the ashes of her torment, with the unwavering help of Laura and the newfound steadfast support of her community, embarked on a profound and deeply personal mission. She started a foundation, a sanctuary of healing and advocacy, specifically designed to help other women like her, those who had been silenced and scarred by abuse, particularly from those in positions of power and trust. She dedicated the rest of her life to ensuring that no one would ever have to walk the horrifying path she had been forced to tread, alone and in fear. Her extraordinary courage, initially a desperate act of survival, had not only saved her own life in the most literal sense, but had also ignited and inspired a powerful movement, a sweeping tide of accountability and reform that would echo through the annals of time, shaping the future for countless others. Her voice, once a whisper, became a roaring testament to resilience. The Church of Saint Sebastian, indelibly scarred by the horrific events that had transpired within its hallowed walls, underwent a profound and transformative rebirth. Under the compassionate and deeply empathetic guidance of a new, truly compassionate priest, Father Thomas, who dedicated himself to rebuilding trust brick by painstaking brick, it slowly but surely grew into a genuine place of healing, understanding, and radical transparency. The very walls that had once hidden the priest's abominable sins and shrouded the suffering of his victims now bore the poignant, powerful testaments of the survivors, not in stone, but in the spirit of open dialogue, support groups, and memorials to lost innocents, a constant, somber reminder of the enduring importance of vigilance, the corrosive dangers of unchecked power, and the ultimate liberating power of truth. Clara's harrowing yet inspiring story, now a foundational narrative, was woven inextricably into the very fabric of the town, not as a source of shame, but as a stark warning against complacency, and more profoundly, as a beacon of unyielding hope that shone brightly through the profound cracks of a once shattered trust, illuminating the path towards a more just and compassionate future for all. The town council established a permanent oversight committee comprised of both clergy and lay members to ensure accountability within the church. Education programs were implemented in schools, teaching children about healthy boundaries and the importance of speaking out against abuse. The Saint Sebastian that emerged from the crucible of scandal was not the same town. It was a town transformed, scarred but stronger, defined not by its past failings, but by its hard-won commitment to truth and justice. Clara, though no longer residing in Saint Sebastian, remained a guiding light, frequently returning to speak, to offer counsel, and to witness the continued healing of a community that had, in the end, chosen courage over comfortable silence.